Hello there, my name's Simon Timperley from the International Food Safety and Quality Network. Welcome to edition 110 of the Food Safety Fridays webinar program. First things first, I know it's a bit belated, but Happy New Year. It's the first webinar since before the Christmas holidays, so it's nice to be back. Today, the subject is 12 months of GFSI food fraud requirements, and that's with Douglas Moyer and John Spink from Michigan State University. Food fraud is a hot topic, and there are demanding requirements now in standards, and it's often very confused. So great to have this as a subject today. Just to say, I'd like to thank the sponsors of Food Safety Fridays who are supporting it again this year in 2019, and that's Mettler Toledo, Safe Food 360, Trace Analytics, AIB International, and DNV GL Business Assurance. So thanks to our kind sponsors. Yes, I can see you're already using the chat bar. Type in there. Say hello, tell us where you're from, and obviously put your questions in there throughout the webinar, and we'll pick them up at the end. It is being recorded today. We issue afterwards to all registrants the recording, the slide deck, PDF, and the certificate of attendance. So if you do miss a little bit, don't worry, we will be following up afterwards. Okay, at this point, I'd like to introduce you to our special guests, Doug and John from Michigan State University. Hello, are you there? Good morning, John. Is Doug there? Yay, full house. Hi, guys. Just let the audience know where you're calling in from today.
Okay, well, this is John Spink, Director of the Food Fraud Initiative at Michigan State University, and I'm calling in from campus, East Lansing, Michigan.
Great. And Doug?
I'm waiting for my grandfather clock to stop chiming.
Oh, don't worry about
it. Okay. I'm calling from Cocoa Beach, Florida.
Very nice. Okay, guys, I'll just tell the audience about next week, and then we can get on with the presentation. In the sidebar, ladies and gents, you'll see a photograph of the very handsome George Howlett, the CEO of Safe Food 360. And next week's webinar is establishing specific criteria for supplier and product risk assessment in your supply chain. So click the register now button. That'll open a new window. You can register right now or respond to one of our emails during the upcoming week. Right, okay. Without further ado, here is the slides. So we're ready for the presentation. I'll be back for the Q&A later, but for now, I'll hand you over to John and Douglas.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and really glad to be a part of this session. You know, food fraud is definitely new and evolving, and really important that we get together and talk quite a bit. So as I said, I'm Director of the Food Fraud Initiative here at Michigan State University. I'm also an assistant professor in the College of Veterinary Medicine. That sounds kind of crazy, maybe veterinary medicine or not, but that's where our food safety program is housed. And also it really makes sense because really Sinclair Lewis, The Jungle, that book was the first real food safety focus in the U.S. And so the first food safety professionals really were veterinarians. So that's where we're there. But we work really, really internationally and across interdisciplinary. So Doug, maybe an introduction from you?
Yeah, I'm assistant professor in the Master of Science in Public Health. That's housed in the College of Human Medicine over at Michigan State University. And I do teach some modules inside of the Master of Science of Food Safety online, again, housed over in veterinary medicine.
All right, great. Thank you. Now, I think Doug and I have to both make a little statement about Michigan State University. We're both wearing our green and white today. We had some changes in our American football, college football team coaching staff. So we're very supportive of that and glad to see them moving around. So we just have to give our plug for our alma mater here. So.
Yeah, nowhere to go but up.
That's right. So anyway, to get to the presentation, so we're looking at 12 months of GFSI food fraud requirements. This has been really fascinating to have followed this over, say, the last 5 or so more years. Originally, GFSI started looking at food fraud with a food fraud think tank, and that was in 2012. And I was one of 4 people on that, and really started just ask questions about food fraud. And the board of GFSI was really starting out to say, what's food fraud? What can be done about it? And is there a role for GFSI? And so that's 2012. So really, in the world of standards and certifications and regulations and things, it's really moved at lightning pace, because that was about the time that food fraud was being defined as a separate possible concept, being considered as a possible concept. And then to that 2012, there's time for a report. So 2014, or end of 2013 is when we submitted our think tank report. That went to the board. They published a position paper. We'll go into details of that in 2014. And then they made the statement that the next guidance document was going to include food fraud. So food fraud and these requirements should not be a surprise to anybody. GFSI did not spring this on anybody. They clearly defined the statement back in 2014. So we'll go through that. And that's interesting now to look at 12 months, because you should be already in your second year of fully implementing a food fraud program. So with that, we'll move forward, and Doug will take the first sections here.
Great, thank you. Today, one of the sponsors for today's webinar is DMVGL, and we have a couple of slides to show you and show our appreciation for the collaboration today. As you can see, they're a global entity, and they have a lot of people, a lot of locations, and do a lot of services inside of the food industry. Let me go to the next slide. Let's see. First to adopt some blockchain in their industry, and they have a rather novel approach to it. They issue their certificates through blockchain, so they can be immediately retrieved, and they're immutable. And a rather novel use of blockchain. And additionally, this innovation of virtual audits, as you may as a brand owner, it can be rather expensive to bring an auditor in for assistance, and they offer a service of virtual audits. And lastly, here's the contact information. Shauna is new to this position, Shauna Wagner, and there's the contact information. So you should take that down if you're interested in this. And John, that's the end of the DMVGL slides.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, and before we go on, just from my standpoint, DNVGL has been someone that's been involved with GFSI quite a bit. They've been really key, offering insight and expertise to a lot of the work that we do. So really appreciative of them being a part and working together on this, and look forward to doing more. All right, to get into the food fraud content piece, what we'll do is we'll give you a little bit of background and then get right into the real GFSI focus. And first off, it's important when you're hearing from people that are talking and giving you advice and insight, is to figure out what they do and where they draw upon their source of expertise, because there are many times people that are confused themselves or refer to maybe things in a way that aren't exactly aligned with maybe some of the bigger picture. So just real brief about us. So we are academics. That's what we do. And you'll see a cycle in the bottom right: research, education, and outreach. And it's a key is that it is a cycle. So outreach is us talking to you, and even putting this presentation together and conversations on the phone here while we were setting up the webinar, there were new insights that came up, and everything's changing. You're the ones that are the experts. You're the ones in the front line. Every one of you on the call. I don't know your business better than you. But what we do is we put together your insight, GFSI's insight, and try to put together these summaries. That then goes into the research. So we look at what the questions are, and then think about them, digest them, process them, look at other disciplines, look at best practices, and then publish them and share them. We have a lot publicly out there, like this video even. And then that gets into education. And education really is beyond, we would consider this more training of this, or overviews, but education are graduate courses, and those are the real in-depth programs. And then that goes back into outreach, that content feeds around. For us, our primary method of communication are our MOOCs, Massive Open Online Courses. These are basically 2 2-hour webinars. We have 4 of them that are running. They're on demand. You can see those at MSU websites there, free, open, and online. We do executive education. But the key for us is the graduate courses. This is truly education. They're very broad. We have 6 graduate courses. They're 3-credit online, completely online courses. 6 of them related to food fraud in one way or another. And if you take 4 of them, you can earn a graduate certificate in food fraud prevention. And the key with this, we got feedback from companies, whether they're brand owners or service providers, that they wanted to have some structured set of program to send their people to and have a university type of affiliation with that. And then those credits can roll into our Masters of Science in Food Safety. It's all online as well. This is a real Michigan State University Masters of Science, and probably quite a few people on the line here. Your employees or colleagues have probably been through that. So what we're going to do here is look at this review of the GFSI Food Fraud Technical Document 2018. So when we're looking at a year of GFSI, these are things that should have been in place. But don't feel bad if you don't have them all in place, because everybody's learning and GFSI realizes people are learning. But what I can tell you unequivocally, with no hesitation or reservation, GFSI is getting what they want. The food industry, the food itself is getting what it wants. The key is that people are starting. You are prioritizing this for today, over 500 people on the call live. You're prioritizing this among all the other things that you could do. That's what GFSI wants. The food industry needs to take a preventative approach, needs to take a holistic approach, and it has started. Now, also do not feel too bad if you haven't got it fully implemented yet, because so February 2017 is when GFSI released their guidance document. Everything was due January 2018. And then in the middle of 2018, GFSI created a food fraud technical document. And that's what we'll cover today. So halfway through the year, they wanted to give some clarification. Now, the first thing that we really want to talk about is this transition again, or this evolution. And back in 2011, that's the first time that we interacted with GFSI. They had been back to Michigan State. And so that's when we first learned about this. And along the way in 2011, Doug and I were working on projects, and we're having trouble writing grants and getting published and things because people didn't know what or didn't know what food fraud was. And we spent half our time trying to explain that it was a real thing. So in 2011, we published an article in an academic journal defining food fraud. Now, we didn't develop the term, but we were the first to have it be the subject of a research paper, the terminology as a subject of a research project and paper that was published. 2011, the GFSI Guidance Document 6 came out. No food fraud in that, and that makes sense because food fraud was just starting. And then 2012 is when GFSI realized they needed to take a look at it. We'll say food fraud is an idea at that point. What is it and what should we do? In 2013, the horse meat incident occurred. So while the GFSI think tank was operating, that really it got crazy, absolutely crazy around the world. It was unbelievable what was happening, and it really gave a lot more focus and redirection to the project. So in 2014, GFSI did publish this position paper on food fraud prevention, and we really would say that that's when we think food fraud was conceived, because it was defined as a thing, and it was defined as a requirement that the industry was going to have to meet. This is not a you should do it. This is a must do it. If you don't have this, you're going to lose your GFSI certification. You're going to have audit nonconformances. And then in 2017 there, GFSI published Guidance Document 7, and then the compliance was due there in January 2018. And that's really when we'll say food fraud was born. That was when it was really required and out there. What we did see is after that, midway through the year, they did publish a food fraud technical document to just clarify what had already been discussed in the past and presented. So the announcement for GFSI was there May 9th, and they published a blog post, and then they have this technical document. So there's the link right there. You could also just type it in an internet browser, look for it. GFSI food fraud technical document probably. So that's where all the information is, and that's where the source of this the content today comes from. So in conjunction with the presentation or the blog post. Then what we saw is GFSI presented at the Food Safety Summit. So Jillian Kelleher is the Vice President of Quality and Food Safety for Wegmans, grocery stores in the Northeast and the East Coast. She's Vice Chair of GFSI, so she's one of the 3 really leaders of the GFSI board. And she presented there about the Food Safety Initiative. What you'll see here in the GFSI governance is real clarity. And you might say, well, I don't agree with what GFSI says or they do. Well, that's fine, and you can give comments, but they make the decision of what's in there. And you'll notice here, first off, there's a Consumer Goods Forum. So that's a global group of CEOs, leaders in the world of all companies, not just food. They then establishes GFSI board. So that's the authority that's coming from the owners of those 300 plus companies. Now, if you notice here, there's arrows coming in and there's only one arrow coming out. So the stakeholders, which are all of you, us, we give recommendations in. And then they ask, GFSI creates a mandate, but they receive information from the technical working groups and local. But a key is GFSI does set, the board sets what's going on. Now you can give your feedback or be a part of that, but that's a real key. And that's where this is defining what is in the GFSI standards. Now the people like IFS, FSSC, BRC, SQF, they seek endorsement from GFSI that they meet GFSI's expectations. On the other side here is just things they've talked about that you may have seen before. 4 types of food risks: food quality, food safety, food fraud, food defense. They note that they're different. And then also we look at the types of the types of food fraud. And then another key point is that here that GFSI defines that there's 3 pillars in a food safety management system. That means 3 separate assessments, and we'll show that here as well later. But in the food safety management system, there's one assessment in one column that's food safety. That's traditional HACCP. The next column is traditional food defense, which is evolving a bit with FSMA IA rules. You have to be real careful about the scope. That may be a topic for another time. But GFSI is a separate set of assessments and prevention plans there. And then food fraud is a separate pillar. It requires a separate vulnerability assessment and a separate prevention strategy. I'll say, Doug, before we move on, how am I doing here, and any key points to add?
You're doing great, John. I thought to back up on the evolution, and this is the perfect slide for it when we have HACCP, TACCP, which is the threat analysis for food defense, and VACCP, which is the vulnerability assessment for food fraud. Back to the evolution of food fraud, getting from awareness and outreach and definitions all the way through to prevention and prevention strategies. And especially those brand owners that are maybe having an epiphany that this is an auditable offense right now. They might say, well, this is a really big elephant, and how do I go about eating this elephant? And the old joke is you eat the elephant one bite at a time. I think the key is to know which end to start on. I think a better analogy might be we need to paint a full Mona Lisa. But I can guarantee you there was a sketch, a pencil sketch somewhere before the full masterpiece was done. And that's what we're going to get at today, is how to get started, how to do the sketch of the masterpiece to follow. And it may take a long time, but GFSI is getting exactly what they wanted: your awareness, your beginning. And it's not going to be as fully evolved as a HACCP prevention strategy and analysis, because that's decades old tools, and it's being used rather well. We have to get into the VACCP routine and VACCP tools. That's all I've got, John.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, actually, I'll stay in that slide. I did see some questions came in that are really good ones at this point, and so I'll make sure to address them throughout. One was about Canada. What's going on with Canada? A key is really with all countries. Food fraud, if it creates a health hazard, is illegal one place or another in a law. If it creates a health hazard, then it's a food safety hazard. Excuse me. Second is there's usually consumer fraud legislation going on. Now, one thing that Canada does have, and actually one of the first virtual meetings is Monday, is a food fraud work group. And so that's a group to look at food fraud and look at it overall. So there's definitely a lot going on in Canada there. Now, one thing you said is about GFSI and FSMA. Now, GFSI and FSMA aren't the same thing, but obviously GFSI is very aware of FSMA. And so there are a number of documents that compare GFSI and FSMA. A real key is whatever you do, you need to scope out that specific definition of the activity involved. So, being FSMA compliant does not mean that you're GFSI compliant necessarily. And if you're GFSI compliant, does not necessarily mean you're FSMA compliant. You have to just check on all all the details. Another question regarding the FSMA that came up was about, FSMA is only important if you export to the U.S. That's correct. Absolutely. But what we find is that, when we're in Europe, a lot of people will say, we don't want to hear about FSMA. But most companies do export something to the U.S. So being aware of FSMA is a really key point. But FSMA is outside the scope for us today. We'll maybe the only thing we'll do is we'll mention where we think you might need to be a little bit careful, such as there in food defense to have the definitions right. So moving on to get into the GFSI document. So GFSI's food fraud technical document, really GFSI just reiterated their previous statements. Nothing new is in here. Food fraud is a critical component of a food safety management system. It's not optional. And people will say, well, food fraud doesn't usually cause a food safety incident. Well, that's true, but for food safety, you're looking at root causes. And that's where GFSI really took the focus here, as they said they're looking at those anomalies, the root causes that lead to the potential for a food safety incident. And that's where, whether it's ISO 31000 risk management, Six Sigma or other, really looking at root cause analysis and prevention is the way to go. Now, that doesn't mean that a food safety plan is going to be just as big, or a food fraud plan is not going to be as big as a food safety plan, but they all need to be considered. And GFSI was crystal clear on this. The key points that they had were its holistic scope, all fraud and all products. So you might be responsible for incoming raw materials. That's great, but your company is accountable for all types of fraud, all types of products throughout the marketplace. So think about Jillian Kelleher, who was there presenting for GFSI at FSMA from Wegmans. They need your product to be fine wherever it is on the shelf. And just you could say, but our ingredients are fine, but there's counterfeit packaging. That's not good enough. And that's where a lot of these breakdowns occurred. So GFSI clearly has this holistic scope. Next, GFSI's emphasis is just get started. And it's really great that they wrote this, and it's in there constantly. We'll go through some of the details. Is they're not expecting this to be HACCP's been around 25 plus years, right? It's been evolved and it's been refined over that time period. This is only not even 25 months old, maybe. Maybe we're heading at 25 months. If it's been a year plus the warm up, it's not going to be that detailed yet. And so GFSI is clear. For point 3, auditors are to confirm the process, not judge the plans. This has been a real key, and GFSI is very aware and working on auditor competence and auditor training along the way. And so that's been a real key. And with this, is the goal is just get started. So the auditor role, as you'll see in the details, is to make sure just that that a plan is in place, not to judge the effectiveness of the plan yet. Now, as we said with FSMA, or not FSMA, HACCP, as we get many years into it, we'll know a lot more what a good plan really looks like. So those are things that are going to come. And a key, the fourth key is just kind of a reminder. The definition includes all types of fraud and for all products. And we'll go through and definitely look at and explain what that means. So, you're probably really looking at the standards for the food safety standards. Again, BRC, FSSC, IFS, SQF, or others. They're based on GFSI. So you may not have actually read GFSI in detail. But this is what the standards need, how they need to comply. So this is from issue 7. And a key here is to look at there's not very much, this is all the detail there is. And we're academics, we do things like count the number of words, 27 words and 31 words. It's not a lot of detail. So the first one, this is consistent across all the 13 sections of GFSI. We just picked one. First off, it says the standard shall require. Now, the key is the standard is clarified because that means the food safety standard. So GFSI is saying that, again, BRC, FSSC, IFS, SQF, they need those food safety standards are required that the organization, now the organization is your entire company. It's not just supplier quality assurance. It's not just warehousing. It's not just retailers. It's your entire organization. And this is, people will say, but we're getting a site inspection. How do the plants know about what's happening at corporate? Doesn't matter. Does not matter. A key is, you say your plant facility. If you have a vacation policy at your company and you have 10 plants, each plant doesn't create their own vacation policy. You have a corporate policy that you implement and maintain at the plant. So an internal auditor would come in, say a human resources auditor would come in and ask the plant, Are you following the corporate travel policy or corporate vacation policy? So that's the key, is that these are corporate policies that are implemented and confirmed they're implemented across the organization. Next is a documented food fraud vulnerability assessment procedure that identifies and prioritizes. Does that say how many categories there needs to be? No. Does that say how long it needs to be? No. Does that say which databases you need? Does it say you need specific types of data? No. So that's a real key. That it's just to have a documented plan. Well, there's a lot out there about different methodologies, but a key is that you have a documented plan and you follow it. It doesn't say that this is a great plan yet, but it says you have one. Now, a key with that is you could write a piece of junk and hand it to the auditor. That's technically a process, and that's technically documented. It's there, okay? That's fair enough. But the auditor confirms it's there. But when you hand that to an auditor, you're saying that this represents a competent approach to this topic. Now, the auditor's not judging that competent approach, but by you handing to them a formal document in an audit, you're making that statement. Your corporation, your CEO, your owners are saying this is a competent document. So that the formality of that document will increase over time, but that's really where we are right now. The second requirement is a food fraud mitigation plan, or we refer more to a prevention strategy because it's prevention rather than mitigation. You're trying to not have these occur in a real strategy. And again, the standard shall require, same as above, the organization, documented again, specifics that specifies measures the organization has implemented to mitigate the public health risks from identified food fraud vulnerabilities. Assess, address. Now, the first step in a strategy is to develop the strategy. So that's one thing that's a real key that we're getting started here. So those are both in place. Now, GFSI also went one step further, and this is not really an additional requirement. It's more of a reminder. Shall cover the relevant GFSI scope. And that's reminding you, making it specific to look at what GFSI's scope is, and that's all types of fraud, all products. Now, again, it doesn't have to be that deep yet. You start the process, you look at your entire company, and then you go deeper only where you need to go. But for this presentation, we're looking at those minimum requirements at the start. Now, before I give Doug a chance to chime in again after this slide, here's from the GFSI document. There's an appendix in the back. So if you have any questions about the food fraud types, definitions, and examples, they're there. Now, they cite a lot of our works. This is a major research area for us, but it's there in great detail. Dilution, substitution, concealment, unimproved enhancements, mislabeling, gray market production, theft, diversion, and counterfeiting. Key there, everything's there. Now, you might say, well, why is counterfeiting? What can we do about counterfeiting? The bottom line is your product is being presented into the marketplace, and your organization needs to have control of it and monitor it. Same with gray market production, but that's legal product that's sent just through a different market. Sometimes you don't have control of that, but you need to be aware of it. And when whoever's buying your products, they want to be confident in your product. Theft and diversion. So a problem with theft is that usually stolen product that's reintroduced to the market is illegal. It might not be a public health threat, but it is illegal. So there's a lot of good examples there as well. So Doug, any additional comments here?
John, I want to try and conserve time for your slides, but I do want to reiterate that it's a top-down approach. We've had corporate quality managers who are in charge of dozens of manufacturing plants, and they're worried, they're concerned. How do they all get audited? Well, the majority of a food fraud prevention strategy comes from the top down, and then customization can occur if necessary at individual sites because their operations or processes might be inherently different than all the rest. But think of this as top down, and if you don't have your senior management engaged at this point, call them. That's all, John.
Great. So with the GFSI document, one of the things is, and I've seen some of the chat on the side looking at different resources. So GFSI is starting to look at more formalizing resource options. And so even there, one thing that they do mention there for additional resources, there's just a couple videos. And that's one thing that we do is trying to get things that are very simple. And these were both previous presentations that we gave either with GFSI or other people. So that was in the back of the GFSI document if you need some more information. So what we're going to do is just look at real kind of quickly. These will all be in the PDF that you'll get at the end of the presentation, so you can use this as a reference. This is from the technical document, and these are quotes from GFSI. We're going to be very clear when we're quoting GFSI and when we're giving our own summaries. But first off, the terminology and definitions. Both definitions, and that means 2014 and 2017, cover all types of fraud and all products. So if you had any debate about that or any confusion, then this is a direct quote from GFSI. All types of fraud and all products, and highlight the motivation of food fraud there. So that's a real key that GFSI was very helpful in explaining, defining it clearly. Next, looking at the detail. When you're looking at the plans and the terminology, it's important to take a step back. This implies that any plans and activities to mitigate, prevent, or even understand. That's it. I mean, any of these things, just to understand the risks associated with food fraud, should consider an entire company's activities, including some that may not be within the traditional food safety or even HACCP scope. So again, if there was any debate, if there's any discussion, any questions, it's crystal clear here that they expect the food fraud plan to cover an entire company's activities. And that's everything across the board that gets the product on the shelf in the marketplace. And also a good recognition and awareness that this is different than a HACCP scope. And that's real clear and real key to put in there for you. And then just to give you a slide here with the documentation to really call it out, that the standard shall, it really refers to the food safety management systems. And we realize, we talk about GFSI compliance, you don't get really GFSI certified. You get certified to those food safety standards that are GFSI compliant. So you are required to implement a food safety management system that is compliant with the GFSI certificate, the GFSI standard, recognized standard. And so the organization, that really, this is again the quote from them. The requirements refer to the organization, and then it's just reiterating here that while a traditional HACCP type food safety approach is applied at manufacturing facilities, these operate within an overall organization. The food fraud vulnerabilities are company-wide, and thus the food fraud scope is company-wide. So again, as you're moving through this and maybe working with your own compliance people, you've got some real good quotes to work on. Now, from our perspective, this is our research point here, is that, and Doug talked about it, top-down or bottom-up approach. A key with food safety and really food defense as well, it's about system vulnerabilities, weaknesses, anomalies that are unique to many facilities. So at food safety, you do audit facilities because it's about the drains, it's about the water supply, it's about process controls locally. And those you then consolidate upwards. And when they move upwards, then you can have some more, the corporate role is more broad and looking at broader policies. Now with food fraud, it's opposite, because if you have a buyer who buys saffron for your company, they're the individuals from corporate that go out and they audit the suppliers, they do the things like that. They have that broad control at the top. And you at the plant facility, your role in food fraud prevention for saffron is just you don't do anything except for use the product that they send you. So that's a real key. And what they do ask at the facilities and in those site inspections is basically saying, do you have a food fraud plan, and do you deviate from it really? And so that's where we see this as a top-down or bottom-up. And for food fraud, it's definitely a top-down policy. At the local levels, you just say that you confirm that you're following the policies and not deviating. So back to GFSI, this whole terminology is key. And it's about all vulnerabilities, but a key is all vulnerabilities are not hazards. So you want to identify as many vulnerabilities as possible. And then to say, well, those 99 aren't really bad. They're not really hazards. They're not really hazards even, or hazards that require preventive control. You want to identify all the vulnerabilities and then dig down and work on the ones that are the major problem. A key with that is then you do have this view of all these vulnerabilities.
Are you able to take over at this point, Doug?
Yeah, I think I can, or at least I can make some small talk. How about some clarification? I'm looking at all the participation is fantastic, and some of these questions just come in so fast. So let me try and answer a few of them. There was a question about what is gray markets. Gray markets are not the usual authorized distribution of goods to, let's say, a known retailer. They might be a kiosk in a mall or in the middle of a street somewhere, or a flea market, as they're called in the United States. You see gray markets are where people might buy food that's about to expire, and they might take them off their hands and sell them or distribute them that way. The problem with gray markets is they're not clear and usual supply chains in, and it's a good place for fraudulent materials to enter. We see gray markets is rather common in pharmaceuticals, actually. Again, for the same reasons. Typically, a medicine is about to expire, and so they'll sell them back to somewhere where they can be resold, and these are referred to as gray markets. There was a question about packaging being in scope, particularly contact packaging, and John and I are both packaging scientists by education, and prior to our academic careers in our employment. Packaging is in scope, but I honestly think it's one of these stones that needs to be turned over and looked at a little bit better. If you're getting a substandard poly whatever film, are you just simply trusting the source? And are they trusting the source for their raw material in doing this? Or is there some validation that's going on? So I think that might be, it may not be a priority, but it is in scope, and I think it does deserve some additional attention. Another one was test. I saw a note there about a food fraud vulnerability assessment tool that's out there, that's available. They're always nice to see them. And then it was saying, but on the application side, is there some kind of testing that's we can do to tackle the high fraudulent raw materials or high fraudulent material products? And I think this goes back to kind of foodies. As food safety scientists, we are used to testing our way around and preventing the known list of bad bugs, food safety. Salmonella, E. coli, we know how to do tests because HACCP tells us which ones and where to do them. So it's very normal for a food safety scientist to default to testing as a routine around this. But let's go back to when melamine was added to infant formula in China years ago. There was no test for it, but I'm sure everybody thought at the time that they had all the appropriate tests for food for that food until the incident occurred. Now, as a standard, melamine is tested for. So I think that's an example of why defaulting to testing as your preventive tool, because you're a food safety scientist and that's what I do for food safety, is creates a vulnerability in itself in your process, in your way that you do this. So I would be very concerned looking for a test for food fraud prevention. Unfortunately, we have to think like fraudsters. We have to think like criminals. And we have to be very imaginative in the things that they might do that would even circumvent a test. I see John is still not in, and it looks like he's going on, but I will continue on. A point about vulnerabilities and hazards. The point here with the vulnerabilities, and the reason you do vulnerability assessments, and as John said, you try and identify as many vulnerabilities as possible, is that each one of them presents a risk that a food fraud might occur. So the challenge right now is to, again, think like a criminal, think like a food fraudster, and itemize where these vulnerabilities are. Hopefully they're in your supply chains, or maybe your contracts can tighten them up, or maybe there is a test that should be done before, during, and after. The key, though, is that these vulnerabilities do present risk, and the real hope is that they are unrealized hazards. And so in the vulnerability assessment process, it's not just identifying all the vulnerabilities, it's the prioritization and ranking of them for preventive measures. And that's where we get into risk analysis and getting into prevention strategies. And I'm not certain how much more I can say unless you want me to catch up with the slides. We could do that, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, if you can try and catch up with the slides, if you can, Douglas.
Okay, I hope my audio is good. I'll try.
Fine.
I don't talk as fast as John, and he probably overloaded his microphone, but so be it. Audit depth here. Let's see, GFSI is aware the harmonization best practices are just now being developed, and a new system less than a year old has to kind of catch up with the HACCP and all the experience we've had for 25 years. And the most important step for the food industry is just start. And we've said this over and over again, and that's why we're just 1 year into the requirements being a rule. And, just start. And I understand there's a massive amount of confusion. It's a huge elephant. I've got 23 sites. How do I do it? Just start. Do the macro assessment and looking down, group your products or your ingredients into maybe 5 and make certain the 5th one is all other. And that way you satisfy a GFSI audit. Did you do everything? Yeah, I looked through the things I bought from Asia, North America, South America, and I don't know, Africa. And the 5th one is rest of world. And if you do an audit, an assessment that way, you do cover all the requirements. So let me try and catch up here with John, at least the slide sets. There's required documents. The food fraud vulnerability assessment is a requirement, and the only other one is, sorry, that was a semi-power breaking outside my window. Sorry. And the other document is a food fraud prevention strategy. This is consistent with FSMA, not the intentional adulteration rule, but the preventive controls rule. FSMA was eloquently written in that it obligates you as a brand owner to anything that might occur, and says that you are obligated to prevent this. And the elegance really is that it does not prescribe how you are to accomplish it. The only 2 things that it requires that you do a vulnerability assessment for food fraud, and that you do a prevention strategy based on the findings of the vulnerability. What do you prioritize? What is your action steps? What is the timing of them? How will you assess their efficacy? That's the 2 things that are required out of FSMA. And so it's best to do them in advance rather than be part of an investigation that's spawned by an incident. But these are also the 2 requirements that come from GFSI, a vulnerability assessment. And it says at least annually. That's about as prescriptive as you'll find anywhere in any of the documents at this point. To say we need to do one every month, your individual circumstances would dictate that. And let's say there's a brand new melamine type of incident. Don't wait around until next December to include that in your audit. Do it now. So there's no prohibition for not going sooner than annually, but we think that annual would be just about the right amount of time to put into a vulnerability assessment. I love this slide. This aren't we just going through a checkbox of yes or no? Did I do a vulnerability assessment? Yes, no. Do I have a prevention strategy? Yes or no? Because auditors aren't supposed to say how robust is it, how thorough will it be. Do you have one? Yes. Is it written? Yes. And do you have a plan or prevention strategy? And yes. Is it written? Yes. Sure. Those are yes or no questions. But at this point, GFSI doesn't expect anything else. And this is your baby step. Maybe you're going to eat the elephant at the start of the tail, but it means that you just get going. So that's why I'm pretty sure here in another slide or 2, we're going to get to what those yes or no questions are. But it is a formal and official process to start. And it's GFSI understands, and they're approving the audit schemes, or I'm sorry, the quality program owners' adaptations of these requirements. So hopefully the auditors are in tune that yes, these are just yes or no questions, but we as foodies or food brand owners think, boy, I need to do more than just a yes or no on an audit scheme, and we agree. But you can't have that finished Mona Lisa right now. You've got to do a pencil sketch of what she looks like before we can go on. I'm going to see if I can advance the slide. Ooh, now that's going to surprise John if he's not attending yet. No, he didn't like that. Okay, maybe he's done there. The next slide, we're going to talk about these 7 or 8 yes or no questions, and I hope the window repairs upstairs aren't bothering people. I'm going to turn my mic off for a second and see if there's some questions we should be answering in the meantime.
Wow, by the way, 768 live online, the most ever, a record, and the comments and the questions, amazing. If you're there, John, we cannot hear you. Try logging out and reconnecting and coming back in. But Doug's doing a sterling job anyway.
Okay, great. I appreciate that. Now I'm competing with a jackhammer in concrete above me. This is the slide we promised. These are the yes or no questions. This is the scope at this point in time of GFSI requirements. This is what the auditors should be asking you, and hopefully you're able to answer yes. Do you conduct a food fraud vulnerability assessment? Yes or no. It does not say how many pages long. It doesn't say which databases did you use. It doesn't say what items did you identify. It just says, did you do it? Yes or no. And it would seem easy enough that maybe at the site level to do this, but we would like the corporate, the executive level to dictate that down to the sites. Is it written? Yes or no? Is it stuck in somebody's head? Do I remember some conversation we had about it? It has to be written. It has to be documented. As people who are audited all the time, this should be intuitive to you that you have a written document, and hopefully it's a living document as proof that you're talking and looking at it on a regular basis. The third yes or no question is, did you implement a food fraud prevention strategy? Food fraud prevention strategies are based on what the vulnerability assessments find. They say, oh, this is a very high risk, or we have experience with fraud in this particular ingredient from this particular supplier, and so we're tightening our contracts, we're adding tests, what are we doing? Did you implement some action based on what the audit, the assessment told you? And again, is it written? As audited people, we know these things have to be written, they have to be captured. The next question is, do you minimally conduct a food fraud incident review? And minimally, it's got to be routine. You can decide if you're going to do it monthly, every 6 months, annually, that's fine. I suggest you don't go past a year, and I suggest you don't let that rule handcuff you should an incident come up very quickly of some particular product or ingredient in some location, and we're just going to wait around to the end of the year. Don't do that. The next one is kind of a note. Is, are you addressing all types of food fraud? We're talking about adulterant substances to substitutions, smuggling, theft, divergence into unauthorized markets, and even down to absolute counterfeits and knockoffs. Have you addressed them all? GFSI expects you to address them all, and I know the things like counterfeiting and smuggling are counterintuitive to foodies, but this is unfortunately with the world we live in, and you're going to have to think like a food fraudster. Oh, let's see if I can back up just 1 second there. The last question was all products incoming and outgoing through. This means the entire supply chain, the ingredients that you have, and all the way back to the products that you sell are in scope of the GFSI item. I see John's into the acknowledgments and still lost. I'm going to try and back. Let's see if I can get here. He doesn't like it. We've got a slide there that'll come in the slide package. And it talks about all the outreach that MSU has. We have MOOCs. These are massive open online courses. There's 4 of them, 4 different subjects, including the food fraud vulnerability assessment prevention strategy. There's an overview. There's an audit guide for food fraud. There's even an audit guide for food defense. These are taught monthly. They're throughout 2019. All 4 of them every month will recur, and they are self-accessing and self-paced. So you can go in there on January 28th and catch the January MOOCs if you like. And they're free. That's counterintuitive again for university, but all of the outreach that's in that slide points back to Michigan State University, that we do offer full credits, we do offer full master's degrees and other professional certifications with respect to food safety and food fraud. So with that, let's try the discussion, and hopefully John can still join us.
Okay, right. Somehow it's good fun. Somehow we've
two of us.
You tug of war between you and John with the slides. I don't know if he thinks he's still sort of live and talking.
Sure,
himself.
I might text him.
But okay,
he acknowledges that he's dead. I see his icon on the screen there, but we'll try our best. Go ahead. What questions can we address?
Okay, let's. Blimey. Questions, ladies and gents. Let's take this one first. It's quite a long one. Pratiwi, we use the S-Safe tool to create vulnerability assessment. Then we got 2 points to be controlled. If we compare it with PAS 96 2018, I think they're really different. Is there any correlation between TASUP and VASUP?
Well, it's a lot easier for me to answer the last question there, the correlation between TASUP and VASUP. And I guess that's because PAS 96 kind of melds food fraud and food defense together. And that's unfortunate. GFSI, I think, does a really good job of separating those two. Food defense is intentional acts using food to cause harm specifically. And this can include a subset of terrorism. It also includes disgruntled employees. FSMA IA rule, intentional adulteration rule, is also food defense oriented, and it has a threshold of significant public health harm. So typically, a disgruntled employee does not reach that level or that threshold of qualifying for prevention under FSMA IA. That's uncomfortable. That's kind of a gap. But GFSI doesn't acknowledge that threshold of significance. It simply says any intentional act that causes harm is a threat and requires a TASUP. And again, GFSI separates this from food fraud, which is the intentional act for economic gain, for profit. And it does not intend to harm. In fact, most food fraudsters don't want to cause harm because that's a really quick way of being caught and detected. So they'd rather fool you and substitute benign ingredients that nobody, including consumers, is unaware of and not harm anybody. But I think, melamine and infant formula was an example of a dumb criminal or a not smart criminal. There's no such thing as a smart criminal. Very clever safety scientists knew that melamine would trick the protein test, but did not think about what that does to small bodies or infirm people and caused a particular risk. So I can't quite answer the front end of that question, but there is a distinction, at least for GFSI and the recognized audit schemes, between TASUP and VASUP.
Okay, another one then, Doug, from Gail. Can you help me understand what a distributor who does not manufacture or repack anything should be doing for food fraud? What could be some of the...
That's good. And that's a great question. And I think that it kind of points to, at least for me, it points back to FSMA. The whole purpose of FSMA was prevention. Move beyond detect and correct, or detect and quarantine and recall. It's about prevention. And the best way to do prevention is know the entire supply chain. I think prior to FSMA, everybody in the supply chain was required to know one up where it comes from and one down where it went to. Now, technically, FSMA says everybody in the supply chain needs to know everywhere, everything. And so really, I take this question as a matter of trust. The person who's supplying you whatever, finished goods, ingredients, do you trust them? Do you test them? And you're now also obligated to know downstream, this I don't know, it's the safety, but the precision of that distribution network. You are inside an entire value stream a value chain, distribution, supply chain, and you're obligated to really know all of it. But let's go back to this, the guy upstream from us, who's selling you ingredients or finished goods. Do they buy a particular substance from a gray market to fulfill a contract with you? Now, that's the questions that have to be asked for food fraud prevention. So let's say I buy 100% of my ingredients from this supplier. That's great. You know that. Do you know that they buy 100% of their ingredients from 3 different suppliers? And that's what this gets at. It's really a matter of trust. There's an old saying, trust but verify. Testing may be the way to do that. But a vulnerability assessment will disclose that I do 99% of my purchases for salt from a single supplier. But, when they run out, I go to the open market. I go online. I find some supplier that can very quickly fill the salt requirements. Okay, that is a vulnerability that needs to be addressed in an assessment, and there needs to be a prevention strategy for food fraud aimed at that scenario. Next question.
Okay, suck deep. If all our food fraud assessment results are low, do we still need to have a mitigation plan or prevention strategy?
Excellent. I'm glad you've got low. I might hazard a guess that you might not be as critical as you could be. I don't know your supply chain. It could be very singular. You buy one substance and make something, sell another one. It could very well be low. But a single recipe may have dozens of ingredients, and almost immediately every one of them has a potential vulnerability. And I'd honestly be surprised if they're all low. The answer, though, to the question is yes. You determine your threshold of risk. GFSI is not saying what is low and what is medium and what to do about it. You obviously have to have a vulnerability assessment. It takes into the conditions, the reports, any smuggling that's been detected. It takes into account news stories, and that's why they have to be done on a regular basis. And if they continue to be a low risk all the way through, a low vulnerability all the way through all of your vulnerability assessments, then your prevention strategy doesn't have to be very robust. It can be, in terms of enterprise risk management, it's monitor only. That I'm not going to do anything, but I'm going to watch the headlines because it could pop up. It could move from low to medium at any time. So I congratulate you if you're truly low and your mitigation plan doesn't have to be excessively robust. You've got a real luxury there.
Okay, next question. Andre, what point should I consider in my food fraud assessment when I consider my own employees?
What point should I consider in my food fraud assessment when I consider my own employees? I've seen some very interesting vulnerability assessment questions that talk about people living above their means, which is implying that somebody's on the take and they're getting money to circumvent a test. It could happen on the receiving dock or some quality assurance guy at the end of the process and changing stuff. I think it's worth thinking about. If you think like a criminal, there's all kinds of vulnerabilities inside of a plant, from the receiving dock to the distribution dock. But the vulnerability assessment would say, is this a high risk? Is it a known risk? A vulnerability, rather? Does it require some prevention strategy? I don't know. If you're using temporary or agency people for your routine practices and the turnover is constant, maybe it becomes a medium vulnerability that these people should be, I don't know what, tested, background checks, something to that effect. So I wouldn't ignore employees. I would simply wonder if they really are the highest or high or vulnerability that you need to be addressing.
Doug, so for food fraud, probably not employees, but more tampering, disgruntled employee, intentional contamination or something like that.
Yeah, and that's an important distinction, Simon, because when we're talking about intentional acts to cause harm, even to the company's brand and reputation, That's food defense. That's a tacit analysis. That's a different set of prevention strategies. That gets to be, is your food manufacturing process got a fence around it, an alarm system, night lights and motion sensors? Well, how high should that fence be? Well, that's based on a tacit assessment that says, well, we've had people easily step over a 4-foot tall fence, so now our prevention strategy can move to an 8-foot tall fence with razor wire on top. So nice distinction, Simon. Thank you. This is about food fraud, not food defense.
Okay, Parmeshwar, shall we consider supplier risk under food fraud?
I think you do. It's again, we're now suddenly all accountable for the entire food supply chain, not just one up and one down. And we have to be equally concerned about is our ingredient suppliers purchasing department, do they have robust prevention strategies? So I think it's a fair question to ask a supplier, how are you doing on your food fraud audits? And what are your prevention strategies? A simple one might say that, we have these contracts, but I'm going to do surprise ingredient testing randomly from now on. And I put that in my contract. You've now just taken a prevention strategy. Hopefully it's based on some level of vulnerability, and you're moving forward. And just the threat or the knowledge that there's going to be an extra test or an extra set of eyes randomly in there, third-party testing, not your documentation, it has a prevention aspect value to that, a deterrent.
John, feel free to switch your video on mic on if you've managed to get back in.
Okay.
Yeah, great.
Sorry, folks.
Hey.
Another question. By the way, we are over the hour. A question here anyway. Shanna, we are a fiber can manufacturer. We have 4 purchase products, paper, steel, glue, and shipping boxes. What would be our vulnerabilities look like?
One thing I'll say, Simon, if you've got the time, I'm fine going through these questions, so we'll follow your lead on this. But
okay.
So fiber can manufacturer, 4 purchase products, what the vulnerabilities look like? Well, the key is you have to you've already identified the types of products you have, and then it would be looking at each of those. You could even start with first off, inside your company, ask people if they've ever been aware of any types of problems. Has the glue ever been off spec? Have the paper products has it always been the proper specification? Has it been too thin or it hasn't been coated? And those are situations where quality control identified problem could actually be food fraud. It depends on the motivation. So what you want to do, you have to do a vulnerability assessment. So identify the products that you have and start to have some type of way that you are going to say that there's a problem or not. Now, when you've got those, then the next step is to look at what could go wrong. And so if the package is, say too much moisture is going to get through and the product's going to spoil and then microbes are going to grow in the product and someone could die, then now you've identified the real problem. Now you would go back and look at different things you could do from a prevention strategy. Now you may already be doing quality control tests on that. Well, maybe now you just more closely monitor those quality control tests. Oh, something, Doug.
I'd like to.
Doug, you had talked about supply chain controls because people worry about their suppliers. So this fiber can company is a supplier to someone else. So if you're a oatmeal company and you're buying the fiber cans with this GFSI process, as well as FSMA from the supplier controls, that FSMA looks at supply chain controls. And so you would ask them, do they have a vulnerability assessment in place? And are they GFSI compliant? So Doug, sorry, I cut you off.
Yeah. No, that's okay. There's obviously a lot of materials, packaging materials here. We already said that they are in scope, and there was mention of food contact packaging materials. I would suggest that those materials would float to the top of a vulnerability assessment, and a vulnerability assessment says not just how likely is it to happen, but if it happens, what's the severity here? And so if a food contact material has been fraudulently substandard, making somebody sick is a lot more serious of a vulnerability than a shipping container that didn't have enough board strength to hold up in shipment and we lost a pallet load of material. That's not going to really hurt anybody. But food contact materials, I would intuitively think that's going to float to the top because of the vulnerability the impact is higher.
The bottom line is you have to do a vulnerability assessment. You have to do a prevention strategy. And that's for GFSI, but that's really for FSMA as well. A question in the past that I did see is about, that EMA, economically motivated adulteration, is listed under the preventive controls rule for FSMA. And that's true, but really FSMA does require that all hazards, that you have a documented hazard analysis regardless of the outcome. What that means is that if you do a hazard analysis and say it's not a problem, that's fine, but you need to document it. And they include looking at food fraud. So essentially, covering this set of requirements was due in FSMA back in September 2016. So you're not only a year behind, you might be a couple more.
I see this question of is ripening of fruits considered fraud? This becomes kind of a fine line for us. We're not talking about marketing claims or health benefits of fraud or fresh, the definition of fresh. We're talking about food frauds that are intended to fool consumers through adulterant substances or smuggling, not necessarily making claims about the ripening process of fruits. Of course, if somebody's selling high-end, no GMO grains or something, or organic, that's easily a food fraud. But the ripening of fruit sounds a little bit maybe off topic for food fraud. John, what do you think of that?
Yeah, it's really about looking at what's the claim, and to go into the detail of what is this. Why do you think it's suspicious activity? And look at that. And what we do a lot of times is look at what law, what's the exact claim, and then what does the law say? Because a lot of times something might not seem right, might not feel right, but it might be something that's permissible.
Okay. Let me just load this one. From Kyriakos. Could food fraud mitigation testing and food defense plan be considered the same document if the defense plan includes a vulnerability assessment?
I can say completely, absolutely, positively, with no reservation, no. Akias, GFSI is crystal clear that you have to have a separate vulnerability assessment for food safety, food fraud, and food defense. They have to be 3 separate assessments. Now, if you've done some other work, then you could split that. You could split that work up. But Akia's GFSI is looking for specific assessments. Now, Akia's those mitigation strategies. You could have one mitigation strategy that's say testing for say there's a cumin purity test, and that would identify that it really is cumin and that it's not a poison. That test could be something that does serve both the food safety and food defense plan. Actually would serve food safety, food fraud, food quality plan as well. So you could have a countermeasure that does apply, but you must have separate assessments.
Okay.
Yeah, unequivocally, I'm sorry.
No, carry on, Doug.
Unequivocally, the answer is no. And the reasons are simple. The motivations between a food fraud incident and a food defense incident are completely different. One intends to do harm and one does not intend to do harm, but they're both intended. That means that the perpetrators are completely different too. We have food producers who may not be authorized, but they have the resources to produce fraudulent food. Those are the culprits there, whereas food defense culprits are maybe a disgruntled employee or a terrorist, and so they are different sets of perpetrators. And lastly, their tactics, their actions, the vulnerabilities they're exploiting are completely different. Food fraud talks about maybe a supply chain vulnerability, and a food defense perpetrator is going to look to cause damage to somebody on the outside, outbound of supplies. They're completely different. Who does it, how they do it, and then basically the reason for this is how do you prevent these two different people from causing two different types of vulnerabilities or threats. So they cannot be the same. Of course, the vulnerability assessment process and the TACIT process, they're very similar. You can learn from each other as you go through them. The lessons learned of doing a good vulnerability assessment do apply to doing a good threat assessment and even establishing prevention strategies and mitigation plans with timing and responsibility. All those things are great learning experiences for each other, but they cannot be the same.
Okay, I've highlighted another question from Nicole. Are sealed trailers, bills of lading, verification and maintaining inventory control an acceptable response to counterfeiting?
Well, maybe I'll take that first. A key first is there's a lot of parts of the question here. So really the first part is about countermeasures or control systems. And our sealed trailers, looking at bill of lading verification and maintaining inventory control, are those competent control measures and control plans? They are some that could be used, but you have to judge it against your specific problem. You say in response to counterfeiting. Now, specifically for us, counterfeiting would be identified as intellectual property rights, trademark counter violations. If you mean, are these competent for addressing food fraud, they are definitely options. But you have to go back and look at the vulnerabilities first. Because if your vulnerability is that your supplier is swapping out saffron, none of these things will help. If the problem is that someone at a truck stop is breaking into the truck and swapping out bags, then the sealed trailers could be. Doug?
Yeah, I agree, John. It's tough to answer the question at face value. It seems like a yes. But if trailer theft is a very low vulnerability in the total assessment, then it's more of a solution and seek of a problem.
So you have to do that's why you have to do the vulnerability assessment, and that's this root cause analysis, and then you can look at the control plans and make a really, really optimal decision.
Okay. Right. Here we go. Another one's popped up. Honey. I've highlighted the wrong one. Sorry. This is from Merzouk, and it is could sourcing from GFSI certified sites be considered a good control measure?
Well, a key is, again, that is definitely a countermeasure control measure. It is an option. So when you buy from someone, I mean, it's real logical, and this is something that we recommend to retailers, who then we recommend to manufacturers. And so people would ask this, is a first question of a supplier would be, are you GFSI compliant? And if you are, then someone could say, oh, then you must be fully GFSI compliant. You must have a food fraud vulnerability assessment and prevention plan. Please send it to me. And by the way, we're on a phone right now, and Doug and I are going to be talking in another 10 minutes. Since you've already got it done, just shoot it over to us. That can create kind of chaos, and that's what you want. You want people to be addressing this. So a GFSI certification, just asking the question of, are you fully GFSI compliant, does include food fraud, that is part of a supply chain program. Taking one more step to ask them for the one-page summary is one step deeper. Then maybe you set up a call and go through it in detail. That's even one step deeper. So that's definitely it's showing that you're making an effort to look at your supply chain.
Okay, great.
I would like to say that in a fully matured vulnerability assessment program that's GFSI sponsored, endorsed, and certified, 20 years from now, just like HACCP is, the answer is yeah. I think that's a pretty fair thing. But by accepting a yes right now, what we're saying is that person upstream has already finished their Mona Lisa, completely in full detail masterpiece. It's too early to say yes.
Okay, great. This is a statement, a comment rather than a question. James Delamere, what of the Missouri farmer 140 million worth of corn and soybean and wheat as certified organic when it wasn't? Are you aware of that? Any comments on that?
Yeah, well, number one is looking at this as there's basically, we look at this suspicious activity and say, what's going on here? So there is this corn and soybean that's the statement is that it's certified organic, and it wasn't. And so that's obvious. That's definitely food fraud, because this was for economic gain, unless we know anything else. But it looks clearly like it was for economic gain, and so that's identified as a vulnerability. And so if you're buying, so what do you care? Why do you care? Well, if you buy or certified organic corn or soybeans, and you label your product as organic, then this would be a problem for you. This would be a vulnerability. So when you're looking at the incident reviews, when this pops up in the news, in your news feed or your internet alerts, then you would identify this as new information about a vulnerability. So you would then go back to your supply chain and look at, number one, did you buy from this Missouri farmer or someone else? Number one, that would be a problem. But then to look at the way that you buy product, the way you certify product, and also your traceability back to say, how did they confirm organic? Now, another piece of this is a step further. Sometimes there's different type of tests you can do. Where let's say that the biggest problem with this corn was that a fertilizer has magnesium in it or something, and that magnesium that's safe would be in the corn at a higher level in a conventional product than organic. That might be like a trigger or just something you look for. It's like just looking around for bad guys. The bad guys kind of run away. So this is a real key of looking at. You want to take in every bit of intelligence that you get. Doug?
I think you're spot on. I think you addressed it. It's back to motivations and intentions. We know that Mexican farmers growing corn south of the border are getting GMO pollen or whatever going into their corn. But were they trying to deceive somebody by saying they were non-GMO when in fact it was GMO? So it's back to kind of motivations. I saw one question I really want to address. I'm picking the easy questions to answer. There was one there that said, when I consider an employee committing an intentional act to harm the company, should I consider it as a food fraud or a food defense issue? Back to motivations. For economic gain is food fraud. To cause harm, and that includes economic harm to a reputation to a brand, that's food defense. So back to categorizing what is food fraud, what's not. Disgruntled employee is typically food defense.
Okay.
Something to look at, interesting with that is why do we care about that type of nuance? We care because we're trying to prevent, and that's the field of criminology. And so that's why it's really important to look at the motivation and understand why people are acting the way they act.
Okay, Bedelia, supplier questionnaire versus supplier audit.
Well, the thing is there's a scale of intensity of what you're doing. So if one thing is you could send out, okay, so in the next 10 minutes, if you're the supplier quality assurance person and you have an email list of your suppliers, you could send out a survey in the next 10 minutes. And then as long as you track to make sure they responded, that survey could come back. So the supplier questionnaire could be, are you GFSI compliant? Did the auditor cover food fraud? That can go out and back quick. You also, in that way, you have a broad perspective and you can address all your suppliers at once. Now, someone could just send back yes, or they could ignore your question. One step deeper is an audit. Now, an audit could be online. You could then have a web call with each person and have them show it to you on the screen or something. And then it could be going to facilities all the way to people that do mass balance. That we've had people that sit with stopwatches on the fill line to see if they can make as much product as they say they're making. So there's a range here. They're all very competent.
Okay, just Edward. He's trying to be practical and simple and quick. Could the vendor annual self-audit questions be developed to ask the vendors what they have in place to prevent all types of food fraud good enough for our food fraud assessment?
It's really the same as that previous question. It's just to start asking questions. It's interesting that say like at the airport, when you come in internationally, they may ask a question like, or someone in just a police investigation, they might say, are you aware of any illegal acts that have occurred at your company? That's a very broad question. And you could just say, no, they don't have any evidence at this point that maybe they do or they don't. But they're asking a very specific question. You now are lying to an auditor or an inspector or investigator or police officer. That's a problem. If they don't ask you a specific question, and so they ask these broad questions. So you could ask the vendor, do you have a food fraud prevention plan in place? Yes or no. As long as it's documented and you retain that, and this, if you have it in this annual self-audit, then you're asking them a question. And if they say yes and they don't have it, you go back and you ask. You say, oh, but here, I've got the paperwork. You said on this date that you had it. That could be a problem. So you want to ask those questions so that people have to check a box and they have to then commit to do it. Not say, oh, I didn't know that's what you meant. And that's real key.
Okay. Another one, Patchy. Any data available for fraud with fresh fruit and vegetables that you know about? Any instances?
Two parts there of the question is where is their data available? And that's looking at incident databases, and there's definitely companies out there that have summaries of incident databases. Something you can do is you can also look, some of those databases could be the RASIF database in Europe, the European Commission or FDA recalls. And the second is fresh fruit and vegetables. So you say, first off is where is their data? That's a great question. And then specifically for fruits and vegetables. For you, you could just start by internet searches, asking internally and looking at that as well.
Okay. Just a question from me. I'm aware of the melamine thing in baby milk, shoveling melamine in there and killing babies. What other products are sort of high risk? I think I've heard of honey as well. Can you tell us about some of the higher risk products that are,
Well, a key is there's again, we have to be academics and kind of split things up. There's two ways to look at it. One is the nature of the product itself and the nature of your process. It's how you buy and how you get that product in. So if you buy off Craigslist or bags of saffron off a local internet auction, then your purchasing processes are so risky that you could be buying one of the least fraudulent products in the world, and it could be subject to stolen goods or something. And the other part is the nature of the products itself. And definitely products we call them credence attributes. So you don't know the attributes. So if you don't really know the difference between a certain level of honey or a certain grade of scotch, then you're more vulnerable, or organic, natural, country of origin, things like that. And then also about those products are products that can be blended easily. So one thing with melamine was milk, and so that's fluid. So you put 1 gallon in a 50-gallon tank, and it blends instantly. If you put 3 pepperonis in a bag of pepperonis, then they would be a little bit more separate. So they wouldn't be as homogeneous. That's kind of the same thing with honey or things that are blended. If you get oregano that's the leaves versus ground, then you could do a lot more site inspection, or even to see at the bottom if there's grains of sand. If you're getting full leaves, you're getting full peppercorns. So it's a combination of both.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that it does seem to be a short list of the usual suspects, right? Extra virgin olive oil, honey, premier wines, premier whiskeys or scotches, things like that. And the reason they get on this list is, first off, they command money. They have high value. They're very popular. The other reason they get on the list is because the supply chains are volatile. Supply and demand doesn't keep up with the other ones, and these creates these vulnerabilities, opportunities for professional food fraudsters to step in and say, you know what, this week we're going to tackle high-end wines. We're going to get into relabeling them, call them 200-year-old bottles, and sell them on auction houses. I mean, that's how you get on the short list of the usual suspects: money and opportunity.
Mm. Yeah, and James mentions there, James Delamere, Sudan red colour found in sweet red pepper powder. I think that was used in ready meals in the UK a few years ago as well.
Sudan red pops up again and again. And this is something, before our research on food fraud, we researched more all intellectual property rights counterfeiting of all products. And one thing we saw with consumer electronics and computer chips is that in some cases, there was a high level of counterfeit in the market. They had a countermeasure, and so the prevalence went down, but beep, beep, every once in a while, that product would show back up in the market. The bad guys would keep trying to get it in. So where did all the melamine go that was made that all of a sudden they couldn't use it? There's still melamine out there places. Now, maybe it's going to the dump, but maybe some people kept a couple bags. So with Sudan red, we definitely see Sudan red pop up every once in a while again. It's made to make paprika and things look brighter, and consumers like that. So Sudan Red is one that started around 2004, but it keeps showing up. And this is showing that, past historical incidents is indicative of where things could happen in the future. Now, maybe the same bad guys aren't doing it again, but someone else comes up with the idea.
Yeah. Okay. Right. We are way over. We can stay on all night. I have to. Is there another one to pick up there? Go on. Let's make this the last one. Alicia, the testing of olive oil at the manufacturer level is cost prohibitive. Do you have a realistic method for verification?
I'm going to throw this right back to you again. So it's going to say, tell me about the incidents. So what's happening exactly? Show me your vulnerability assessment. So why and how are you impacted? And then we can get to talk about what could be some type of control plans or countermeasures or control systems. So, all of a sudden it might be a certain supplier. It might be paperwork you can follow that you don't have to do the exact test. Now, another thing is that you could just tell them that you're going to do some type of test. So say that you buy every month, you get 3 shipments of olive oil. You could tell the supplier that you now are going to do whole product testing, authenticity testing, twice a year. They don't know which lots that you're pulling from, but you could do that test. Just do a couple of the tests on those, and if you do that, then you're gonna reduce your vulnerability, because if you're buying from the same suppliers, they're going to know that eventually they could get caught.
Okay, brilliant.
All right.
Well, despite some technical gremlins and errant builders grinding, and we've wangled our way through the presentation and had lots of fantastic discussion and interaction. So have you enjoyed it, guys?
Absolutely. I really appreciate
very
it.
much.
Great questions. Glad to see everybody so engaged. Please feel free to, look at this video, forward it, and contact any of us for any questions.
Yeah, like Absolutely. I say, the slides will be issued. They can find your details, the courses that you offer, your details. And we will definitely have to have you on again in the future, if you will. Because did you see 771 we got up to, and that's a record. So brilliant.
Great.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks, John. Much appreciated.
Be safe, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon.
Cheers. Bye.